I shall first introduce members of the panel. Cecilia was already introduced, but some people have arrived in the meantime. So Cecilia is a professor at Denver University, a professor in higher education. And then I shall move on to my left. Can I go with you? So Dániel Horn, who is, sorry, I will have to read things because otherwise I will forget parts of your respective titles. A senior researcher and head of education and labor economics department of the Institute of Economics of KRTK. Dániel is focusing on educational research, specifically with regards to non-cognitive aspects of students' output and the efficiency of education. Szilvia Németh is a managing director of the researcher at T2Doc and leader of Creative Partnerships Hungary. Szilvia has been focusing on education for the past decades, and specifically she's working a lot on the question of equality and equity in education. And finally, I shall introduce Dóra Husz, who is head of sector for strategy, governance, equality and inclusion in the Directorate General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture of the European Commission. I hope I didn't misspeak any parts of the title. Dóra has been, prior to focusing on the field of education, in her role has been working in the Directorate General for Justice in the European Commission, specifically focusing on Roma inclusion. I hope feel free to stop me at any point if I miss something. I think we should start with something that relates to Cecilia's presentation and something that Donny has already been broaching, namely the purpose of education. And I have to be honest, I was planning on asking this very question myself, and I'm happy that you did talk about this, so we can move on to something more. What I would like to sort of propose as a starting point is the fact that we have already looked at, with regards to Ken Robinson and also in your speech, the current educational system was designed in the beginning of the 19th century, and ever since that it has been improved and developed in various ways, but it still retains in many of its aspects the primary, secondary, tertiary separation, the hierarchy of subjects. So it retains many aspects of society and societal preferences of the 19th century. And 2 centuries have passed since that. A lot of societal changes occurred, the population has quadrupled, technological advances changed our very way of life. And so I would like to start by asking, do you think that the current system of education, be it the primary, the secondary or tertiary level, is ready for the challenges that are facing us in the next century?
I hope it works. I would like to start just with a field impression that as a researcher I usually go to public educational settings, and what I see is that there are students sitting, young people sitting, bored, disengaged and not interested in the lessons, they just listen. And as Ken Robinson said in this TED Talk, I think the main purpose of education is to reconnect these people with the deep learning itself. And what I mean by deep learning, I think that a creative education can somehow show that how learning can be interesting, how learning can be exciting, and how learning can be really a great experience at school. And if we say this, and if I remember these students in the field, then I would say that the answer for your question is that education should be ready, but it is not ready yet. And my question is to the others also, that what should we do for the education in order to be ready for this challenge?
Maybe I can continue. I think we all agree that the education systems have been designed on the economic rationale for economic growth, and I think we also all agree that this is only partial. And overall, I think we could say that the purpose is to be an enabler, but enabler for success not only in the economy, but perhaps even more in society, and to whether they can respond, whether the systems can respond to the challenges of today's world. And we were talking about it so far, AI, climate change, crisis of democracy. So, and for all of this, the learner and the teacher has to be an active agent. And I think this element is missing in most of today's systems.
Yeah, why, if I go back to your original question, my answer would be no, it's not ready. And one of the main reasons is that it is actually was in my question to Cecilia before that that the current education system is designed by people of the past, in every country in the world they have no rationale to change it because they are the beneficiaries of this system. Now, this problem will prevail as long as we have this democracy or any political system that designs education. So education system will always be lagging behind the social transformation, albeit it should be driving it. But it's not driving it, it's basically following it. So education system is always sort of responding to changes in the social system. So my provocative statement would be that change in the US, so equality increased first, and then expansion in education happened. So it's not the other way around. It's not like expansion happened in education and then came equality or increase in equality, not the full equality. So it's always just lagging behind, and it's because the political structure is designed so that it's, you know, those on the top are designing the infrastructure that benefits them. And it's, you know, it's the same for health, same for education, and same for any social structure. So no, it's not ready, and it's not going to be ready. I think we should be sort of looking outside of education if you want to move social change ahead. I don't know whether it was...
So I agree in a way with what you shared. But I think there are two, no, I don't think the secondary, primary, and tertiary systems are ready. And I think there are two reasons. One, we never ask students how they learn best. We never involve them on the decision-making process for schools. And so a lot of times it's a lot of old people sitting around a table trying to decide what to do. And I think if we involve students more at all levels in the process of designing education, then schools would be better able to prepare students for the future, and students would be more motivated to learn because they would have a sense of ownership over their learning. The second reason I think is that we focus too much on metrics and standards and tests and less on the experience that students are having. And so when we focus on these numbers and these metrics, we lose sight of, again, those bigger purposes for education that people might have. Maybe they're going to school because they want their siblings to see them go to school. Or maybe, you know, they experienced in my country a mass shooting and they want to get as much information as they can to try and change gun policy in the country. Those are big reasons that we can't really measure, but matter and motivate students. But I don't think as an education system in any context, we think about or care enough about those intrinsic motivations people have to learn, or their innate curiosity about the world.
Then it seems to be a consensus that it is not ready. There is some disagreement with regards to whether it should be or will ever be ready. But then I should ask, if we are spending so much money on the maintenance of a system that is not ready for challenges that is supposed to be preparing us to face, then how is it worth for society to keep up the running of such a system? Or is it worth for society at all?
The thing that it's not ready, sorry, that I'm jumping in, it doesn't mean that it's worthless. So that the education we are investing in is, well, it's well proven that, you know, on the individual level as well as on the social level, it has benefits, lots of benefits. On individual level, you know, increasing wages, increased or decreased divorce rate, increased voting rate, etc. On the social level, increased health rate, increased health, mental health as well. So there are lots and lots of benefits of education. But it doesn't mean the same that, you know, investing in education will probably just be, so it will only keep up the current social dynamic, social structure. It's not going to change it. That was my point.
If I can bring in the EU perspective, actually the raison d'être of EU funds is not to maintain systems, it's to bring about structural reform. And that's if we are talking about the new fund, Recovery and Resilience Facility, but also cohesion policy. So lots of EU funds are available, but they have to serve reform. And it's even in these plans that member states are drafting, it's recovery and resilience plans where they have to include their investments for reforms. So the changing of the system is the goal. And I would also argue a little bit with Dani's pessimism that I think every system produces that the people who are at the top are those who are beneficiaries. And I agree that it has a certain inertia, but nothing would change if it was true. And I think there are also these shifts to focus more on equality within the EU as well. We also, there were reactions to Black Lives Matter and to Me Too, and all of this put the focus at least on some purposes of education. So I think equity and diversity is certainly one of them.
I think we are in the period of a change of the paradigm about education. So for me, this is really striking that in the last years there was this pandemic, and we hope that it's not coming back. But for me, it is somehow that we haven't learned the lessons from this period. And as in your presentation, there was this comment on the pandemic hybrid type of learning and all these things. I think there are a lot of things which without money or with the existing money we could do, but we don't do that. And my question is that how can people from NGOs, from business sectors, from research institutions, from teaching institutions, and parents, of course, to collaborate and change this type of educational system and do their effort to do that. And I think that when you started, Cecilia, to collect all these ideas that what should we do for education and what are the challenges, I think for me this is the biggest challenge, that how to motivate people to do something for the education and for the future education and for the future schools, and step out somehow from this type of education what we suffer from. And this is my personal question, that how to do that.
Yeah, I think again it goes back to the intrinsic motivation people have to learn. That the TED Talk we watched, that most children are very curious about the world. If you ever spend any time around a 2-year-old, they ask, I think the statistic is they ask 140 questions a day. Can you imagine asking 140 questions about how the world works every single day? And then something happens as they continue through schools where they ask fewer questions and are given more and more information, as if they are just an empty repository for that information. And there's no role for them to make sense of that information and to continue asking questions about the world. And by the way, 2-year-olds ask really good questions that sometimes I'm like, I don't know why that is. They're philosophic questions. They're questions about the world that matter, that as we get older we stop asking, but we should keep asking. But to your earlier question, Andor, I think there are kind of two issues. One is around accountability and trying to find ways to hold schools accountable for what's happening in the classroom. And that's hard to do because it's hard to measure some aspects of learning. The other is to find those places where magical things are happening in schools and scale those up, and that takes resources. But if we devoted more of that money to identifying where things are going well, where students are coming alive in the classroom and they're motivated to learn and they're gaining new skills and new information, and then finding ways to share that with other places, that would be very powerful. That would be a great use of resources. Things happening like at the Milestone Institute. How do we scale something like that up?
Just a small comment that we can say that nowadays education is a question-driven education, but driven by the teachers' questions. And the type of so-called 21st century education should be driven by student questions and not by teachers, and support this transformation from the teacher-driven system. This would be really important.
Touched upon several really important topics. One of them is how to identify promising practices, and this is possibly one difference between the US and the EU, that here we have 27 member states who can learn from each other and try to learn from each other, and even though education is completely a national competence, they are responsible for the content of their education, for the governance of education, but they share certain trends, so they can peer review each other if there is willingness. But for that, one thing which is also relevant for education, they have to admit, or they have to be ready to learn from mistakes. And I think this was also important in the TED Talk, that it's not only, definitely not only lexical knowledge you can learn from, but you can learn from your own mistakes and being ready to share it. And then the other thing is to actually evaluate, to gather data, look at it, evaluate, and analyze together what works, what not, what is transferable, what is not transferable.
That's a really... In the US, we have a superiority problem where we think we're the best country in the world, and that's bullshit, clearly, but a lot of people believe that. So we're less likely to learn from other places because we think we're the best. So I value and respect the EU because we have a lot to learn from other countries. We're too stupid to recognize that.
I think that's a very important point, that the EU actually facilitates a lot of learning in education systems in the EU. So what we wouldn't be able to do it in Hungary or in Germany or any other countries alone, we could learn it from others. So maybe it's not an EU thing, but one very important example, and it goes back to what Cecilia is saying, that, you know, the OECD PISA, learning from or riding the wave of the No Child Left Behind Act of the US, was started measuring reading and mathematics skills. But now it changed. Now it's measuring also other sort of non-cognitive skills as well, like the problem-solving skills and creativity and other stuff as well. But so my point is that this is still lagging behind the social transformation, and it's not education that's driving these, but education is following these trends. So I'm not saying education is not changing, I'm saying that education is changing because the social structure is changing education systems.
How do we sort of address the problem of who the stakeholders in the system are? In any running education system, there are the learners who are usually deprived of the right of setting the curriculum or the measurement system, as it were, of their efficiency and the learning. And this is going to remain a problem, I guess, but this is a huge problem in as much as whoever is studying in a system is not entitled to design the curriculum, even though the system is supposed to be catering for their future needs. Is there a solution for that in any educational setting?
I think there are participatory learning methodologies, and that we do see in several school systems, that the learners are part of a school council and do take some of the decisions. It's by far not widespread enough, but I think that's usually also the answer to discrimination and exclusion of some minorities. If we bring in the curriculum their histories, their culture, their identity. And so I think there are solutions to this, and of course it's very difficult to say which is the single point where we could make the change, but I think initial teacher education is super important, and obviously we have to attract the most talented young people to become teachers so that they can change and form the system, which is a huge challenge in Hungary definitely, but many other EU countries as well.
I don't think so that this is the task or the duty and the responsibility of a learner to create a curriculum. I think there should be experts and policymakers who are ready to listen to the needs of these students and somehow, based on their experiences, to create a curriculum. And also there are different types of creating curriculum or curricula, like in Finland or in Nordic countries, where there are school councils for listening to students' ideas and channeling all these ideas into the local, regional, and national levels. And there are expertise on the side of the national level to receive all these feedbacks. And this is the key thing, that how to reserve, how to create a system which can give a kind of feedback, and a system which can listen to this feedback and somehow connect these two factors or several factors together.
Okay. Then still riding on one of Cecilia's points, that there are multiple goals of education. So I'm just provoking you, Szilvia, a bit further, if I may. There are multiple objectives to education, and shouldn't it be the learner's responsibility to decide which of these goals they would like to fulfill, and in light of their decision, be able to tailor their learning experience toward best fulfilling that goal?
We should differentiate among the learners, that what kind of age group we are talking about. Of course, what Cecilia mentioned, these second chance students, for example, or those adult learners who can take the responsibility of their learning. Of course, this could be a kind of way to invite them and let them participate in the decision making. And also, when we talk about the 19th century type of school, then I would say that we can talk about the 19th century type of, or early 20th century type of student organizations, because in my experience for not the private education, but for the public education and the state financed public education, there are not efficient ways of channeling the student voice and letting the student organizations work. And in Hungary, I think in the last year, there were many occasions when we saw that when students organize themselves and they have voice, they are not listened at all. And how is it possible that the society is not listening to, or the decision makers are not listening to these students? This is a huge question, and this is not for students but for the society itself.
Yeah, so basically I also think that you have to divide education into different, well, you can call it primary, secondary, tertiary, whatever, but layers or ages of students. And in the bottom line is that you have to teach everybody those navigation skills that Cecilia called, which are, well, to be sure, they are reading and calculating. So they are the ones that the No Child Left Behind started measuring in the first place. And so we'd still think that understanding text or understanding numbers is a very important navigating skill. So there's this level when there is sort of a consensus that everybody should have this. But after that, you know, I can be challenged to say that, yeah, learner-designed curriculum would be a very good idea, but, and then I go back to my argument, they never gonna happen because it's not designed by them, but it's designed by those who were.
It's good that we're on a panel together, because I'm an optimist and you are a doomsday pessimist. No, I'm just joking. I think that when students are invited, and there's research that shows this, when they are invited to understand how they learn and kind of think big picture about their learning, they're much more motivated to do schoolwork, to learn. And so when we think about ways that we can incorporate students into the design of education, maybe that's part of it, is to help them understand the science of learning. And they can understand it because when they're invited to take a step back and say, well, you learn really well when you watch a video, but you don't learn as well in a discussion setting. And everyone has a different way of learning. and how do you learn best? And then how can we design educational experiences? In the US, we have this notion of universal design for learning. And when you do universal design for learning, it's intended first and foremost to help students with disabilities be able to learn, if they're deaf, if they have ADHD, if they have dyslexia. But what we've learned is that when you design learning to reach those students, everyone learns better. And part of it is because they're able to step back and understand how they learn. It's very similar to the curb cuts that are in sidewalks. And they were originally designed for handicapped people in wheelchairs to be able to navigate the world. But we know a lot of people benefit from curb cuts if you're pushing a stroller, if you're riding a bike. And so how can we create educational and learning experiences that are kind of like those metaphoric curb cuts that meet the needs of multiple people and invite them to step back to think about how they learn best and then have influence over the classroom. So no, I don't think they're not being paid to be teachers. We should compensate them if we're inviting them in those ways, but empowering them in those ways I think is very powerful. I've seen it be very powerful with my students.
And I would argue in another way also with your pessimism. I think actually that it's not only the reading, science, math skills where we should equalize and which we should provide to everybody, but very much also the critical thinking, which definitely already well below higher education level. And then also linked to what you said, Cecilia, I think it is very important to ensure a kind of, and I think it's a state responsibility to ensure a level of quality for all, but this is always combined with targeted support to those groups that you mentioned, and actually individualized support to the specific person, the specific learner in need. And the combination of the three is beneficial for the learner society as a whole.
Not just support to the learner, but also the support to the educator or to the teacher in the field. It can be really important and having really good results, that it can create local changes. And just one more sentence about learners' involvement. So in our practices, we have really good examples of inviting learners into a learning environment where their ideas can be just burst and really welcomed. And it can happen if those teachers and supporting people in our practice, these are creative practitioners, they have a kind of space and a kind of time and individual opportunities to create their learning environments for the concrete group of children and for the concrete individuals or a small community of learners. And so not this kind of very centralized model of education is not a kind of good way of supporting the learner's voice or providing the lessons from the side of the learners.
Allow me to slightly move on to a topic that runs as an undercurrent of many of the things that you have said in the last few minutes, namely the sort of the ambivalence between general education and disciplinary specific education. And I'm sort of curious as to your opinion, where should the line of demarcation be? When is the point where students should start specializing in something? And if you allow me, before I let it over, just one more thing. There's a huge, in my view, there is a huge gap in Europe where up until the age of 18, you're in high school, you are sort of going through a set curriculum, and then suddenly you are dropped into a maze of figuring out what you should study then and what specific field you should focus on. So the question again is, where should be this line of demarcation between general education and special education or specific education or disciplinary specific education?
If I may, so it depends on what we want to achieve. So first of all, in the EU, it's not true that everybody goes through education up until the age of 18 in general education, because there are lots and lots of selection points. In Germany, in Austria, and in German type systems, like in Switzerland, student or actual kids, they have to decide at age of 10 whether they want to go to a vocational or pre-vocational education or general education, or their families. In the Scandinavian system, it's age 16 or even above that. So there is a large variance in when you have to decide between, well, we can call vocational, disciplinary, and the general training, or the academic, the general training. But which is more effective? Well, it's debated. Effective meaning, you know, all the things that we can measure, like reading, math, or even problem solving. But if you turn to inequality, or the other question, the other dimension, whether we want more intergenerational mobility or not, it's quite a consensus that the earlier the selection is, the higher the inequality of the given system will be. So the lower the intergenerational mobility will be. So if you force students to select at age 10 between disciplinary and general, there will be a larger inequality on those systems. This is sort of quite the consensus in the literature.
I would confirm that all the studies show that early tracking is not good for equity at all, and I would actually put this line during higher education. Actually, I was lucky at the time of the regime change. I benefited from a full scholarship in an American liberal arts college, and in the first 2 years we had to study from all fields, and it was wonderful.
That's the US model. You have to take general education all the way through to the end of college. And the thinking there is that there are certain things you should learn that cross disciplines. The problem, though, is that the way general education is taught is often very boring and in huge lecture halls. And so a lot of students get very demotivated to learn. And it's really unfortunate because there's a lot that you can gain from that general understanding of the world to be able to be conversant in a lot of different topics. And again, kind of goes back to what I said earlier, but we have a lot of wicked problems that we face as a species, and it's not just going to be an engineering problem that's going to solve climate change. There's politics in that, there's history, there's education. And so to be able to have a knowledge of all these different subjects that you then bring to bear in solving that problem is really important. So I think general education should always be part of education, but we need to rethink how we do general education if we do it so that it's inspiring, it's exciting, it's not something you have to get through until you get to your major choices. I also think that the emphasis on teaching skills that are in demand right now, and this is kind of me repeating what I said earlier, that's a really dangerous proposition because the skills that we need right now are going to be completely different in 10 years. What will remain the same is we need to be able to think critically, like you were saying earlier, be creative, solve problems, work with people who are different than us. And a lot of times those are outcomes of a general education, those very navigational skills.
Going back to our basic question, that what kind of school should we have, then what you said, Dani, that there are so many selection points and there are so many exit points from the system, that what kind of school we are talking about then. So about the school of those who remained in the very basic education and in the state-funded and maintained poor type of education, or about schools in a private education, or at the first selection point or after the second selection point. So I think that with this so many selection points and exit points and so many types of schools and education subsystems, we create a huge gap between the quality education and quality schools, which is of course not the key for the solution of all these questions.
Before we would move on to the question of equity, which you are broaching, and I would very much like to discuss that as well, allow me to just pin this down for one more subset of questions. Multiple people argued for sort of prolonging general education as long as possible, or at least into the tertiary education system, and seeing that one of the aims of educational systems, whether it should be or not, is to produce sort of workforce for the labor market, where specific knowledge of specific skills and disciplinary understanding is required what is the trade-off of keeping general education for a longer time into the system, instead of, say, forcing students at the age of 18 or at the age of 16, as it happens in Switzerland and in Germany with vocational schools, to learn a trade and be proficient about it?
I think specialization has a disadvantage that technologies change, and if we really prepare students for the technology of today, they will be at loss. So I think also in vocational, students learn convertible skills, and basically I think it has to be combined with the approach of lifelong learning, that they learn skills which enable them to continue to learn and specialize when the need arises later. And obviously this means that we are extending the learner's perspective throughout the lifetime, but I think it's probably absolutely necessary for the reform of the systems.
Now, theoretically, there are two ends of the spectrum where you have general education for everyone, like in the US, and then you try to keep students there as long as possible, and then when they know or they specialize when they go to college, and then they go either to the labor market or to PhD. Or the other system is that when you select students early, you put them into a disciplinary study, but then it's not the state that actually designs the curriculum, but you work hand in hand with the industry. So you let current knowledge into the curriculum during their studying. So what students study today, it's different what they studied 10 years ago. Unlike in general systems where these curriculum is basically unchanged. I'm not saying totally, but the bases are very similar. So theoretically, there are these two spectrums. Now, obviously, there are all these bits and pieces that are different in every system, but in general, the German system is thought to be working just fine, as opposed to the Hungarian, which is more, sort of in between. And the American system or the UK system is also working just fine. So these are very, very different systems. They're based on very different political structures. So both can work.
I think if industry should influence the curriculum, and I'm speaking more of the US context, they give almost no money to education, but they expect colleges and universities to prepare students for their jobs. And I just think that's really ironic, because historically industry trained their own employees, and when they needed new training, industry did that. And now it's been pushed off to higher ed, but they don't put any money into the system. So if that happens, they need to invest more if they want to have that kind of influence.
In Germany, they do. Yeah, that's the difference.
That can work. It's basically and I think it's one of the indicators that can measure the success is the exposure of the graduates from vocational schools to work-based learning, if they are really work-based learning in actual industries and if the industries are cooperating. But so I think that can absolutely work, and probably the problem with the Hungarian system is that it is copying the German one, but not actually working within the industries.
I don't know. And also that there is a huge gap between the labor force skills which are needed for the labor force or labor market, and also in the vocational training schools. So I think in Hungary and in the German system, the 21st century skills are not in the forehead of vocational training and education. So there is a huge mismatch or huge gap between the needs for in the vocational market or labor market and the vocational training.
It seems to me that there is agreement with regards to the idea that we should keep as many students in the system as possible, whatever system we are talking about, or we should expand education to reach as many students as possible. Cecilia has already committed to this idea, but you have already sort of implied statements of this sort. Now I'm curious, again, with regards to trade-offs. When we are trying to keep everybody in the system, we have to compromise on certain aspects, I guess. What are the trade-offs for the equity, for increasing the equity of say, primary and secondary education system, and then we can talk about tertiary as well. But the first two layers of the system, as it were, are compulsory in most countries. So I'm curious, what are the trade-offs for keeping it more equity?
Actually, I don't think in primary and secondary, I don't think there are trade-offs. Actually, the countries which are producing the best PISA results are usually the most equitable ones. So, between equity and quality, definitely not in compulsory schooling. And actually, I think what is important is to support the transitions between the levels. And if we do support the transitions rightly, then the students who are poor or disadvantaged don't fall out because they cannot afford. And then I don't think that would be a problem also in the tertiary level.
But we have to say that unfortunately this is not the case if the education is compulsory by 16 or 18, that those multiply disadvantaged children or students, they stay in the system. So there are many small gates how to lose or how to get drop out from the system itself. And in Hungary there are many researches on this topic that we have compulsory education until 16 now, but we used to have until 18. But there are many 14 or 15-year-olds disadvantaged people or pupils who just didn't go through the whole compulsory education. So it doesn't mean that if we somehow make it longer, then those people who the mostly need this type of education will be in the system itself.
So I disagree a bit because there are always trade-offs. So even in primary and secondary level, if you keep everybody there, let's say until age of 18, well, there are certainly benefits. So, you know, equity probably is going to be much larger than the intergenerational mobility is going to be much larger than if you just, you know, lower it to 16 or 14. That's fine. However, there are those straight out of the system, those people who wouldn't need public money, they would be there anyway. So this money could have been spent on, well, maybe the other half or the bottom 10 or something else, healthcare. So, you know, the question is whether it's worth paying all these public payers money on children of the top 10 or the above median who would send their students send their kids into schools anyway, rather than, well, not funding them and funding the bottom half and funding the bottom 10%. And so there are always trade-offs in this sense, which is, I think, these questions fascinate me a lot.
But maybe then a response to that I think basically the classes can integrate a certain portion of disadvantaged, excluded kids to the benefit of all. But it's true that there is a threshold. Like if the majority of a class is disadvantaged, then it will become very difficult for the teacher to provide the necessary support. But if that ratio is reflecting the diversity of the society, diversity of the population, then it can be done I think social skills compensate, for example, from some others, that the majority, the advantaged majority also benefits from having contacts with disadvantaged and minority groups. I agree that you raise an important question, who should pay for it? But in that, I actually believe in the Scandinavian model that universal systems are more equitable, even if, unfortunately, they spend money on the rich as well. But the problem, if you label a kind of service, then it becomes in itself discriminatory.
In that regard, we see a huge difference between the US and European systems where, I just checked it yesterday, according to OECD data, in the US around 40% of the funding going into educational systems is coming from the state, whereas the average for the European Union and Europe in general is 70%, with extreme cases such as Germany with 82%, Hungary I think 72%. So we have very different systems with regards to who pays the bill. And based on what you just said, Dóra, it would make sense to argue that it's much better if the state supports it more. And yet we see sort of, in terms of economic output of the education system, we see a booming US higher educational system. Everybody's striving for it. So how is it reasonable for say European countries to pour all that money into an educational system where there are alternatives?
It is difficult, I agree, but I think that for higher education, if the purpose of higher education is predominantly economic, as it used to be in the 19th century, then indeed we should not finance this for the more well-off who could pay for it themselves. But I think all of that would only work if the scholarship systems, if the support systems are fully in place, and if it doesn't prevent. So for the universal system, that I actually meant up until higher education, but I think it is crucial to include, to have social quotas, to give extra support, and to make sure that the less well-off don't fall out because they cannot afford it.
I agree with Sir Ken Robinson that children have a desire, an innate desire to learn, and are curious and creative. I think the problem is that we often teach to the majority and we miss the different ways the minority learns. So there is a tension when we provide more access and equity. Well, no, we're providing access. You can come, not necessarily equity. You're not going to necessarily have an equitable experience depending on how the classroom is structured. And so unless we provide more resources to differentiate those educational experiences like we've talked about in this panel, then yeah, there are trade-offs, because then there's pressure to lower standards because the students who don't learn as well in the dominant ways aren't going to do as well, and you still have pressure to get them through and graduate them. So I think it really, again, pushes us to rethink education and how teaching and learning happens. And until we do that, then yes, there will be trade-offs.
Before we finish, we are getting to the end of the time. There is one more question. There are a lot of topics that we haven't been able to discuss. Unfortunately, the topic education is slightly bigger than what 1 hour allows us to discuss. So I prepared with a sort of a childish question that I would like to propose to all of you. If there was, because we were talking about policy and we were talking about sort of standards of the system and how to run it. If you were to be given the chance to change one thing in any educational system that we are looking at, whether it's with regards to primary, secondary, or tertiary, or whether it's with regards to geography, what would you change and why?
It's one I ask my students. I phrase it a little bit differently. I say, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing, what would it be? For me, I'm going to speak from the US context because that's the system I know the most about and I'm the most invested in. It's funding. Like Andor said, 40% of university funding comes from the government. And because of that, we have huge student loan debt. Higher education is very expensive. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm the oldest of 7 children, and I'm the only one that's gone to college. I grew up very poor, and my family still lives in deep poverty because they just can't find a way to financially make it work. If we invested at the level of Germany and Sweden and Hungary, I think it would be very different. So for me, it's funding.
For me, it's probably teachers. And I'm not saying, yeah, now change all teachers. No, it's sort of having teachers that are motivating and fun and can inspire our students. I don't know who are they, but that would be my magic wand if I could.
I think that if I could change one thing, I would somehow create learning environments where students could experience the flow of learning. Like Csikszentmihalyi said, I think that somehow have this great learning experience or optimal learning experience and having optimal learning moments in education and give the school to students and ask them to use it, and they have a kind of opportunity to create a framework that how to use this school and what the school is for.
I was tempted to say at the beginning that I would enforce diversity because I think that there the individually rational decisions create dramatic results for societies. But I would also refine a little bit what Dani said. I would change the incentive system for teachers.
I would like to invite members of the audience to join the conversation if they have any points or questions to make. I should have said it earlier so that you had some time to think about it. So while you are gathering your thoughts, there is just one more bit I would like to bring in on the basis of what you and Dani and Dóra said with regards to teachers. It has been already broached by you, Cecilia, earlier, namely that there is an ongoing sort of feeling of crisis in many people, that the technological changes that we are seeing are sort of going to relegate our teachers useless or not needed. And I'm just sort of curious about your perspectives on this, whether this is actually the case. Is there going to be ever an education system where we won't need teachers?
No, I don't think so.
I would agree. I think teachers are super important, but their role needs to be changed, and they have to become also agents of their own learning and learn sometimes from the learners.
Prestige of teachers in the society should be changed, and also not just the role, but the content of teaching, and also the teachers' training, what you mentioned before, that how is it possible to create really good teachers who can matter and who can have a kind of leaders in the background and not in the front of the blackboard, but to create environments.
I think there was already a question.
Működik? Igen. I would give more creativity and freedom to teachers in terms of the materials they use and present, and if we could fund it more, then potentially students wouldn't even need to carry textbooks and things like that on a daily basis to schools, but there would be enough rich and creative materials and tools at school, and they could just rest at home. So it's basically two things, but kind of covered by just give more funding for teachers' creativity. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much, first of it. It was very interesting. And I was just wondering, like, when we talk about education, we often address the needs of the youth. So the children, and then we talk about this age of 18 and the higher education. So what about adult learning? In the countries like US and in the EU, how would you compare the situation? Do you think that's essential to provide adult learning opportunities, and to what extent? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And in the US, we have, I think the majority of students now are considered in tertiary education are adults. And adults, there's research showing that children, you need pedagogy, which is the science of teaching children, and adults need andragogy, which is the science of teaching adults. And one of the essential things, and I teach graduate students, so they're adults, that adults need when they're learning is to understand why they're learning in that way, why the teacher is designing things that way, how it connects with their world experiences. So that's absolutely essential. Also, as we continue thinking about the role of technology and artificial intelligence in society, there's going to be a constant need to go back and learn new things. And so maybe it's not you have to go get a whole new degree, but you have to take new classes or learn new things. And so we need to think about a lifelong learning model where people have the opportunity to learn no matter how old they are, no matter how closely they are connected to schools.
Yeah, I would also agree that it's super important what you raised, and I think there is in general a consensus within the EU that this is important. There is a target that all the member states agreed about adult learning. There is not yet sufficient data to feed it, but what we already see is that the variation within the EU is extreme. In several member states, it's below 5% of adults. In some others, it's 60%. So there is a lot of room for mutual learning in that domain, and this is when we compare it, for example, with tertiary attainment or participation in kindergarten. There we see that there is a consensus which also generated a positive convergence, and the range between the countries is getting smaller, and it's an upward convergence. In adult learning, it's just a huge variation, so there is still this need for convergence upward.
Does it work? Yeah. So you've talked about change and like the need for change a lot, but I was just wondering, how long do you think it would take to actually see tangible change in society and in the adults of countries and like just anywhere really, especially that if I think about education and long-term investments in it, it makes me think of climate change and how a lot of the times governments are not really willing to commit to it because it's something that seems so far away that I just think there's like a connection between the two. And yeah, I was just wondering, how long do you think it would take actually to see it?
Students ask me this question all the time because they feel this sense of urgency to change things, and they have energy to change things as well. I think as the older you get, the more you get beaten down, and that's why we need young people leading. But what I often say is that we're trying to get to this point off in the horizon, and we're in this really big, clumsy ship, and it's kind of going like this. And it's kind of making its way there, but it's going to take some turns and twists to get there. So I think it takes, again, working with young people who have that energy and that urgency and helping push us so that we get closer. But it doesn't often happen overnight. If the pandemic didn't change things significantly, then we have a lot of time ahead of us before things significantly change. But I hope someone disagrees on the...
No, just to answer the first part of your question, that in the period of pandemia, we saw that it was enough to have only one night to start the digital education. And if there is a kind of need or there are energies, as Cecilia says, to do something, then we are able to do something. If we don't want to, because there are many other things, then it can last for 100 years, I think. But if we organize ourselves and we cooperate and we use our imagination and we use our ideas and connect somehow, then this is possible even in one night, I think.
Maybe to add to that, I think you put an important point on why it's not so popular for politicians, because they want to make changes during their cycle. But also there is an optimistic message that a crisis can be a window of opportunity for a much quicker change.
Just one last sentence to this. So I really like this ferry, this ship parallel. But you know, if you're on a ferry and you suddenly twist the steering wheel, nothing will happen for a long time. And it's the same with the digital education. So every school has to switch to it, like 3 years ago, and still nothing happened. So that's...
I think we have time for one final question or comment from the audience. If there is any. Yes.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on this online education, obviously my generation has been like growing up more and more in like this online space. And I was just wondering, most of you mentioned the need for more funding, but obviously when it comes to online education, the funding costs kind of like go down. So like, do you guys think it would be better to maybe optimize this online learning space rather than get more funding, which is really hard from governments or from like other organizations? So like, what do you guys think about this?
I think you need a lot of funding for digital to prevent a digital divide. But if it's done correctly, then I think it could help to democratize education. Everybody can listen to the same Harvard lecture and things like that. But without the extra attention to equity, it will lead to even bigger differences.
That's where something like artificial intelligence can come in, because I mentioned this in my talk earlier, but in the early 2010s, we had the massive online open courses, and they would have these massive online lectures. And what they found is a lot of people would start the classes, but they didn't finish because it was just kind of lecture based. It wasn't engaging. It wasn't interactive. So yes, if there's ways to scale up some really cool AI inventions and make it more engaging, I think it could be very powerful and it could work really well. But it again, you need like people who know about learning and teaching to design those and partner with people who know a lot about technology.
But without the proficiency in social emotional skills and creativity, critical thinking, it wouldn't work, in my opinion.
I think my role at this point is to sort of officially announce an end to this conversation. I would like to thank you all, Dóra, Szilvia, Dániel, Cecilia, for your participation. And thank you for the audience, for your patience and your questions. Thank you very much.